gets at something that we don't think about, splitting Christianity, but it does. And the question that it gets at is this question of an exorcism that occurs, right? We have this exorcism occur as part of the text. And that is one of those things that's really odd, because Christianity creates really weird alliances when you start to ask the straight-up exorcism question, right? Because if you think about it, Roman Catholicism believes in exorcisms. Anglicanism, like the Episcopal Church, which is part of mainline Protestantism, believes in it. And then like Pentecostals, which is sort of an extreme version of evangelicals, believe in it. But the majority of evangelicals do not believe in it. The majority of mainline do not believe in it. And most Catholics don't know that the Catholic Church believes in it. Okay? And so you end up with this weird hodgepodge where it cuts across Christian traditions. And it's one of the questions that we as pastors get every so often, usually by particularly brave confirmands who want to mess with the pastor. Okay? Which is, do you believe in exorcisms? And I'm going to break one of the cardinal rules of preaching, though I break those every week from what I was in theory taught at seminary, and I'm going to tell you, I don't know. Let me explain why I say I don't know. So, in my ministry, I have never performed an exorcism. Okay? The closest I've ever gotten is I've had 3 different house blessings where the purpose of the house blessing was because something weird was going on according to the owner. They wanted me to bless the house. I went, and I can report to you, nothing weird happened. I said some prayers out of the ELW, which has a house blessing thing, did it, and it was like all the other house blessings that I was brought in to do just because they bought a new house. Okay? Now you say, well, okay, Matt, you're a rational, modern guy. Why would you even leave open a back door to something so superstitious? Isn't that sort of like stupid people from an earlier era that's superstitious? And I say, no, not really. The reason I say no, not really, is well, the majority of my mainline colleagues would immediately sort of say, no, this is just superstition of an earlier era. I'd go, here's where I go at. So I grew up Episcopalian. Episcopalians have dioceses like we have synods or districts. They have an exorcist in each one. One Episcopal priest is set aside. Just like in Roman Catholicism, one priest is set aside to be the exorcist. And growing up, I had a parish pastor who, smart guy, normal guy, sort of an academic type, very smart, ends up going and becoming a chancellor of one of the Episcopal schools. He had a case where he was part of an exorcism, something he never wanted to do again. We talked about it once, and I was like, well, that's weird. So I'm a normal, faithful, good guy who did have a weird experience. Growing up, another pastor I had who was in New York, who went on to become a bishop, he also had an equivalent thing. See, I had a friend at college who went on to become an Anglican bishop in Kenya. And he also had an equivalent thing or two. They're normal people. These aren't psychotic weirdos. These aren't superstitious people with superstitious time. And yet, they rationally say, yeah, you haven't had the experience, but I have. For example, y'all know I spent some time in a Catholic seminary. Got to know some of my Catholic professors. One of my best pastoral care professors was this guy. He had a PhD, MD from Stanford in psychology and psychiatry. So he was a licensed psychologist, licensed psychiatrist, and then because, he was a real slacker, he went and got his doctorate in theology so he could be a professor. Okay? So, brilliant guy, man of science. Like his thing he was trying to always beat into us when we were in class was, yes, you are people of faith, but you are also people of science. So when I got my first call where someone said, I'm having strange things happen in my house, can you do a house blessing? I was like, sure. I called him. And I said, hey, you have all this background in psychology. I don't know what I'm doing. I have like 12 credit hours. I want to make sure I don't shortchange this person in case there's a mental health issue. He says, oh, absolutely. So we talked for like a good hour. He gives me, this is what you should look out for, this is what you should refer to, this is who you talk to, this is who I talk to in your area, and all of this. Super helpful. And I'm about to hang up the phone, and I say, hey, thanks for being a resource for me. That's really helpful. You might have to call you in the future. And he said, absolutely. In fact, no matter what happens, give me a call when you get back. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, if you make the reference, I'd like to know who you referred to know how it went. I went, okay. He's like, oh, and by the way, if it is an evil spirit, I'm also the exorcist for the Catholic Church in this area, so give me a call. And that is when I just stopped. I was like, oh. So we had another hour conversation after that. Rational guy, smart man of science. And yet, he always left the back door. There's a reason they put him in charge, because they didn't want someone who was just going to go do exorcisms willy-nilly. So, I'll say the thing we were never supposed to say as pastors, which is if you ask me a question, I don't know. It's not my experience, it's not my spirituality, it's nothing I have seen. The few cases I've seen where someone has gone there, it's been clearly like mental health issues, and I've made references and such. But the majority of Christianity believes in it. I'm hesitant to say that I'm smarter than the majority of Christianity. However, if we get stuck in this debate, exorcism, no exorcism, we get stuck being trapped within the confines of Hollywood. What do I mean? Well, if I think about exorcisms, most of you out there, when you think exorcism, you picture in your head, you're thinking like The Exorcist or Chucky or some other movie you've seen, right? I'm betting none of you have actually been to a physical exorcism. I know I haven't. I'm betting most of you probably haven't. So when you're referencing it, you're referencing the movies, the television, this world. You're not probably even talking to people who actually do. Okay? Which gives us this false dichotomy as to what it is, right? Because our only reference is a sort of sensationalized view. And I think we get caught in debating whether or not, the writers of The Exorcist were right or wrong. We really limited what the Bible's trying to get at when they talk about exorcisms. Because, well, this might exist as something. Again, I told you, I don't know. I do think that the pattern, that the analogy of an exorcism does have some real valid usefulness to it. It has real valid usefulness when we talk about people who have suffered trauma. And most of us have suffered some form of trauma in our lives, whether or not be it individual trauma, generational family trauma, or whether or not it's cultural or national trauma. Most of us have suffered some form of trauma. And trauma can haunt you much like the allegory of a demon. Think about it. If you've ever worked with someone who's been in abusive relationships, whether or not talking partner, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, one of the sad realities is you never work with someone, what we think of it is what Hollywood tells us, which is you gotta get them out, you gotta get them safe, and then once they're safe, the work is over. Yay! The reality is, yes, you've gotta get them out, you've gotta get them safe, but the work is not over. That's the lie. Because we know through math, through anthropology, through psychology, through sociology, that if you get someone out and you get them safe and they cut off the connection and they get going and they don't deal with the trauma of what has occurred to them, statistically, they're very, very likely to fall right back in with another abuser. Because they go to themselves some months or years later and go, I'm finally done with that, I got that person out of my life, now I'm going to start dating. And if they haven't dealt with the trauma of what occurred to them, they meet a nice, normal non-abuser, they go, man, this person's boring. This person never goes ahead and gives me gifts. This person doesn't know my favorite lipstick and that they should give it to me just randomly. I want that romance. And if you're still walking with them as a psychiatrist, as a friend, as a pastor, as a therapist, you're going to say, no, what you're missing is love bombing. Love bombing is this thing where people who are abusers will often come in and shine all this attention and love on you and attempt to lure you in. Create a really, really good time because unlike you, they know a really bad time ahead. It's the hook to keep you in. It's the carrot to trap you in the trap. If you haven't dealt with the trauma, you might go looking for that carrot again and not even know it. It's not that you want it. It's not that you deserve it. You definitely don't want it. You definitely don't deserve it. It's almost this thing beyond who you are. pulling you to do the last thing you would ever want in your life, which is to fall right back into another relationship like that. And yet, when we step back and anthropologically look, we know that's a really highly likely outcome. Almost a force beyond yourself pulling you in. I don't believe it's a demon from hell that's doing that. I totally believe it's psychological trauma and all this that can be explained better than I can by therapists and psychiatrists and psychology. But the analogy sort of works, right? Because to give up those pieces of trauma is painful. It's hard. There's sort of emotional convulsions that occur to rid oneself of that pain and of that trauma and to do that work, which isn't something that happens overnight. It is step by step, inch by inch, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, grudgingly hard work. The sort of pain that you see in the analogy that is an exorcism. But if you don't, you're going to head back to the same hell you came from, just like in an exorcism. The analogy holds. But it doesn't just hold for those of us who've experienced individual trauma, or those of us who've experienced intergenerational trauma. It holds for all of us because all of us live in lands where there's been cultural trauma. Let me explain what I mean when I say cultural trauma. So people will often ask me about my early career in the church, so pre-nativity. And what I tell them about my early career is I specialized in going into places that have real big problems. Okay? And usually I go in, a bishop would say, here's the problems, or the community would say, here's the problems, help us fix it. And I go in there and I work with them. Now what I found out really early on in my career is the single best way of identifying the problem was not for me to sit there and diagnose people. That was useless. I wasn't that great at it. The best way to do it was simply talk to people and say, do you think everything's working well at the church? And they would inevitably say no, or they wouldn't have hired me, right? And then I said, well, what don't you think is working? And then they'd give me a list of things that aren't working. They say, why do you think those things aren't working? They get a list of why they don't think they're working. And then I look for commonalities where like 60, 70% of the church would be in agreement over what the problem is. And I'll tell you, when 60 to 70% of the church is in agreement over what the problem is, they're almost always right. But then they also say the same thing. They say, well, our real problem is we can't grow. Well, why can't you grow? Well, we get a lot of new members, but they leave very quickly. Well, why do you think that is? Oh, well, we have Old Aunt Mary, and Old Aunt Mary screams at everyone when they don't butter the bread the right way. So no one wants to volunteer for it. Okay, so who's talked to Old Aunt Mary? Oh, no one talks to Old Aunt Mary. Well, why does anyone talk to her? Well, she's the matriarch of that family down there, and they get mad at you, and you don't want that. So we all know what we need to do. We all know where one of the problems is. We need to invite Old Aunt Mary to no longer volunteer in this position. And so you do. But with that comes a lot of pain. With that comes sorrow. With that comes folks who go, no, that ain't right. I'm not going to go. Right? There's pain to the community, there's pain to there. That's the convulsions that they speak about during the exorcism, right? But we all know that if you leave Old Aunt Mary there, she keeps running everybody off because she tells you how to butter, which side of the bread you're supposed to butter. It's never going to get better, right? And you're just going to continue to go back to the same hell you found yourself in. See, there's cultural exorcisms too. Whether or not you're talking about church, family, person, or greater culture. For example, in the United States, we have our own demons we seem to fight from generation to generation to generation that comes back in a new form every so often, right? One of those things is racism, right? So we went back to 1860. You knew the racists. They were carrying guns and in Confederate uniforms flying Confederate flags, right? Then if you went to the 1960s, they were men in white clothes burning crosses, right? Then if you go to the 1980s, you had David Duke, who was the same racism you saw before, each time before, except for he came in a polo shirt and slacks and dress shoes. Those of you who don't know who David Duke is, Google. See, we have our own demons in our culture too, just like we do in our families, just like we do in our institutions, just like we do in ourselves. And part of what we do as Christians is it's not just the job of clergy or the job of holy people somewhere to do this, but we're all called to work towards the exorcism of those demons. With the knowledge that it is hard, it is painful, and it takes time. But the alternative is far worse. So as you go out today, the question I want you to ponder in your prayer life is, where are you called to exercise which demons? Is there trauma in your life being left unaddressed? The therapists, psychologists, pastors, whoever, might be able to help you. Is there intergenerational trauma that you and your family live into that the world of counseling and therapy and others can help you with? Are you called to fight for justice and work on undoing the demons of society or institutions you work, live, or are part of? Take time and ask yourselves, where is your role as your own exorcist in your own world?